Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for Nonprofit HR's virtual learning education event. Today's session is entitled Harnessing AI for EDIJ, Navigating the Bias Challenge. My name is Atokatha Ashman Brew, Managing Director for Marketing and Strategic Communication for Nonprofit HR, and I will be your conversation moderator for today. We have a lot of great content to cover on this very important topic. Before we get started, though, I would like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. You have joined the presentation listening using your computer's speaker system by default. If you would prefer to join over the telephone, just select telephone in the GoToWebinar audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed. You will have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenters by typing your questions into the questions pane of the control panel on GoToWebinar. You may send in your questions at any time today during the presentation. We will collect those and address them during the Q&A session at the end of our time together. Today's event is being recorded and you will receive a follow-up email within the next few days with a link to view the recording. Along with those assets, you will receive additional information regarding any assets that were shared during today's call. Just a brief note about Nonprofit HR. Since 2000, Nonprofit HR remains the country's leading and oldest firm focused exclusively on the talent management needs of the social sector, including nonprofits, associations, social enterprises, and other mission-driven organizations. We focus our consulting efforts on the following practice areas: strategy and advisory, HR outsourcing, total rewards, equity, diversity, inclusion, and justice, and search. Again, you will have an opportunity to ask questions to our presenters throughout the webinar. And now, a little about our presenters. Dr. Rachel Forrester is a senior consultant with our equity, diversity, inclusion, and justice practice. Dr. Forrester provides subject matter expert advice, insight, and strategic direction to her clients. She oversees complex client engagements, manages projects to completion, and designs and facilitates EDI training solutions and assessment services for partners and stakeholders. Rachel has been doing equity work in higher education for over a decade. Most recently, Rachel served as the Associate Director of the Office of Identity, Equity, and Engagement at UNC Charlotte, where she also obtained her doctorate degree in education leadership and higher education, focusing on racial equity. As a critical whiteness scholar, Rachel's research includes understanding and deconstructing whiteness to promote racial equity. Our second presenter is Millie Gonzalez, and she's a consultant with our EDIJ practice as well. Millie provides subject matter expertise and strategic direction to her clients. She oversees and contributes to client engagements, manages projects to completion, and designs and facilitates DEI training solutions and assessment services to stakeholders. As a consultant, Millie contributes expertise in strategic planning, team development, curriculum building, DEI programming, facilitation, individual coaching, and group coaching and translation services. Millie has worked with a variety of clients in the education and the nonprofit sector. And now, Millie, I would like to turn it over to you to get us started with our main presentation for the day.
Thank you, Atokatha, and good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, wherever you're joining us. Really excited to have you all here in the space today, and excited to be partnering with my amazing team, as well as Dr. Rachel Forrester, to bring this content to you today around AI and navigating our bias challenge. Atokatha, thank you for that wonderful introduction. Just wanted to add a bit more context. I spent the first half of my time in the DEI space as an educator. So I spent the first half of my career being a teacher in the South Bronx to high school students, which is where I learned the importance of creating learning spaces and creating spaces where people can lean into challenging conversations to move this work forward. As I transitioned out of the classroom to better support leaders in the nonprofit leadership sector, I had the opportunity to see how some of the DEI challenges that I saw in the classroom were still emerging in the nonprofit sector and nonprofit space, specifically challenges around bias, how to navigate bias, and how to support each other around developing awareness around our biases and how we can use that awareness to mitigate some of the challenges that we have in our culture and work environments as we work towards building more inclusive cultures. And that's really what brought me to Nonprofit HR. I love the opportunity to work with a variety of organizations, to work with this amazing team, just to help organizations, leaders, staff build their DEI toolbox so we can create more inclusive spaces and really create culture of belonging. And I want to pass it over before we jump in to Dr. Rachel Forrester so she can share a little bit more about herself as well.
Thank you so much, Millie, and welcome everyone. As Atokatha and Millie shared, my name is Dr. Rachel Forrester. My pronouns are she and they, and I'm a senior consultant on the Equity, Diversity, Inclusion, and Justice team at Nonprofit HR. Similar to Millie, I have a background in the education space, mostly within higher education, where I have worked as Assistant Director for Gender and Sexuality. I research and publish on social activism, gender, race, and anything really related to doing less harm in our daily life. I truly believe that however many years we've been alive on this planet is the amount of time that we've had socialized into understanding the world the way we understand it today. And one of those ways is through bias, through messages that we receive from the time we were born, from either our caregivers or the people around us or media or school. And so I have a passion for being hard on systems and soft on people while holding people accountable, meaning that I would like us to all shift into accountability together with this idea of doing less harm, creating inclusive spaces, and creating a sense of belonging for all of us within our organizations and for the people and missions that we serve. So we're very excited about diving deeper into this conversation about bias in AI. I think it is a very timely conversation. It's a conversation that has started almost a decade ago, and we've progressed into really thinking about generative AI and what that means for our industry. So I'm going to pass it back to Millie to get us started on our journey today.
Thanks, Rachel, and really excited to jump in with you all and jump in together. So where we'll be heading today is the following. So we wanted to ground some of our foundational objectives. And as Tokatha has shared earlier, feel free to keep those questions coming in through the question pane on your webinar control panel. And we'll make sure we address those questions towards the end of our session today. But really want to ground in where we're heading today and what our session will be focusing on. So today we're going to explore a little bit the upsides and downsides of AI within the context of equity, diversity, inclusion, and justice, or EDIJ. We're also going to talk about the impact of algorithmic bias on marginalized communities. So not just what is AI, but also what is the impact and what do we mean when we talk about bias? And what are some of those real life consequences and harms that AI can actually create and perpetuate when we as users are unaware of what to look for and how to minimize that harm? We're also going to provide you all with some practical tools and strategies for effectively identifying and addressing bias in AI systems, which ultimately are going to contribute to more equitable outcomes and creating those inclusive spaces that we all know we want to create and continue to grow and expand in our organizations and broader communities. And last but not least, we're going to share a little bit about how to partner with leaders in strategic business units and in your organization to recognize but also minimize bias. So that's where we're heading today. We hope this is an engaging session, so feel free to jump in as we go. We'll have some questions for you all, but also feel free if you think of any questions to share those in the questions pane as well throughout our session. But to begin, we're going to start by reflecting a little bit on our personal stance impacting and what we think of AI. So we want you all to take a few seconds and reflect on the following two questions. So what feelings, thoughts, or images come up for you when you hear the letters AI? And how do you think this might impact how your organization engages with AI? We really want to hear from you all. We want to hear your perspectives. So feel free to put these questions in the chat pane. We'll keep the conversation going, but we'll keep an eye on that as your questions are coming in and your responses are coming in, because we really want to see what thoughts and feelings come up, recognizing that we all have different experiences with AI, and we want to learn about those different dimensions of diversity and how you all have experienced and what comes up with AI as well. So what is AI? And we want to ground here because we recognize that we're all entering this work from different experiences. So some of us might be very familiar with AI. If you're like me, about a year out, I was like, what is AI? What are we talking about? Does this mean robots are going to take over the world? What's going on? So we want to ground on really what are we talking about when we're talking about AI? And really all we're talking about is AI, or artificial intelligence, as it's known for its longer term, is really the ability for computers to perform cognitive functions that we associate with our minds as humans. So things like perception, reasoning, learning, interacting with an environment, problem solving, and even exercising creativity at times. And it's almost a science of making machines think like us, recognizing that machines are not humans, but giving them the ability to do things that we may have not considered machines to be able to do before, but are now able to based on how technology has evolved over the years. While this term has been around since the 1950s, it's revolutionized and evolved over time. We're going to talk a little bit about that and what it means. But keeping in mind that artificial intelligence technology is really the conversation around how can computers process large amounts of data in ways that are unlike humans. Right? So while we want it to have cognitive abilities, and that is what artificial intelligence refers to, there are also things that computers and systems can do in these data systems that go beyond that space and scope. So when we're talking about artificial intelligence, we have different components. You might have heard some of these, and for those of us who are new to this, no worries. This is why we have this content here. But we might have different components such as machine learning. And this is really referring to artificial intelligence applications that automatically learn and improve from previous sets of experiences without requiring that explicit programming. Things like neural networks. So when you hear this term, we're really talking about those computer systems that are modeled based on our neural connections, which is incredible to think about, that we can create these programs and systems that kind of mimic how our human brain evolves and our thought processes, so that we can then enable what's called deep learning in the artificial intelligence space. We also have natural language processing. So teaching computers how to understand the way humans use language. So things like Google and allowing platforms such as Google to make sense of what we type into that search bar. So a lot of us are like, I've never engaged with artificial intelligence. A lot of us engage day to day whenever you type that random question into Google and get those responses. That's part of the artificial intelligence umbrella. And last but not least, robotics. And this is the one we see the most portrayed in the media and some of those futuristic shows like Westworld and other shows that some of us might be familiar with. And these are really machines that are mimicking humans and can assist us without our involvement, where it's where some of those thoughts and emotions might come up. So just giving you all a set of some thoughts of what artificial intelligence is. But curious of any thoughts that might have come up with what thoughts or feelings might be emerging when you think about AI. And Atoka, I don't know if we had any of those responses come in, but how are people experiencing this? What thoughts and feelings might be coming up? Keep those coming in.
Hi, Millie. We're still waiting for more responses to come in. We've just got a few, and they have somewhat of a space theme. So out of this world theme, certainly futuristic is what people are saying comes to mind for them when they think of AI. We'll keep checking in and get back to you.
Thanks, Atoka, and thank you so much for engaging, y'all. Your responses are coming in anonymously, so feel free to continue sharing them. Be open, be vulnerable. That's what this space is about as we continue our learning. We also want to broaden our perspective and share a little bit about possible applications for artificial intelligence. And we'll share a little bit more about this in more detail, but things like visualization, audio analytics, image analytics, Internet of Things, right? The fact that we can type anything into Google is amazing. Sometimes I sit in awe and I'm like, will Google really give me an answer to this question? The answer is yes. Machine translation, social network analysis, machine learning, deep learning, simulation modeling. And again, this is not an exhaustive list, but just a list of options and things to consider for how we use artificial intelligence today. But the lens of our conversation today will be focused on generative AI. And this is a simplified graphic, but really what we're hoping here to demonstrate is that there are other aspects to elements to AI, and we wanted to emphasize where generative AI lives in the broader scope of artificial intelligence. So keeping in mind that generative AI is one of the most popular and consumer-friendly AI models to date. So it's something we use quite often. And some of the components of generative AI are things like image, coding, text, video, speech, decision-making. And it really lives within that deep learning space, right? Where computers are learning ways that mimic that human brain, as we were talking about earlier. So building those layers of knowledge and becoming increasingly complex as we continue to utilize these systems and input data. So really being able to process a wide range of data, wide range of resources like images, text, requiring less human intervention. I think this is one of the things that really fascinates us about artificial intelligence. Can this make our roles easier? Can this help broaden our capacity to focus on other parts of our work and day-to-day role and how we engage with each other if we're able to utilize this in a way that is equitable and mindful? And can it produce accurate results? Right? So really that's where generative AI lives. Again, this is a simplified model. So I don't want anyone walking away thinking, this is all generative AI is, or artificial intelligence. We just want to show you where it lives in the broader scope of our umbrella of artificial intelligence and keeping this in mind. So if you're like me a few years back, I'm like, I don't really want to have this conversation. I don't like the idea of robots and someone replacing my role and all these other pieces. I'm just going to avoid this conversation. I'm not really using AI. But lo and behold, we use AI every day. And I mentioned Google as a previous example, but some of us use iPhones. My Android users might not agree, right? But Android users also have AI technology that they're utilizing. But our iPhones, for example, we just had a new iPhone release, but years ago, Apple created Siri, right? Siri is an example of artificial intelligence. Those of us asking our Alexa to set an alarm for us to wake up every morning or play our favorite music or station while we're working, that's a form of artificial intelligence. ChatGPT has been one of the most popular forms that has been around the media and that we're learning more about day to day. And again, this list is not exhaustive, but just grounding us in the fact that AI is around us. It's something that we are using. And it's something that's being embedded into our day-to-day lives, which means that it's also being embedded into our day-to-day work and practices in our organizations and when we engage with each other.
And one of the interesting things is, even as we were preparing this webinar for you today, I was having a little glitch in my technology earlier, and I could no longer hear anything on the computer. And then all of a sudden, this automated voice pops up that was processing everything that I was saying and actually was trying to help me find a solution. And so I must have hit a button on my computer that actually started some sort of artificial intelligence as it relates to hearing my voice to help me problem solve. And so, Millie, I think that this is extremely timely in terms of how we use artificial intelligence within our organizations. And so again, in that questions pane on your GoToWebinar panel, we would love for you to type in, what are some ways that your organization has used or maybe even thought about using AI? Go ahead and type those responses in. And as you do so, we wanted to highlight some of the results from our 2023 AI Pulse survey results. One of the things that we asked you all within the social impact circle is, how do you use AI? What are the ways that you're currently using this within your organization and for what tasks? And what you'll notice here is that you all use AI in a variety of different ways. From taking notes during a meeting or summarizing meeting notes to researching information, you also are using this for job descriptions. I know that this is something that we've had conversations about internally at Nonprofit HR as well, of what is the ways that generative AI can help us amplify some of the things that we are doing within our own organizations. And so we're also putting a link to the 2023 AI Pulse survey results for you all to take a deeper dive, and really thank you all for participating in providing us these results. I'm going to pause there and see if Atokatha, are there any results that have come in so far?
Yes, Rachel and Millie, results have started to come in from that first question for sure. I'll read a couple of them. One person said, I'm excited about the opportunity to partner with technology to systematize and streamline aspects of our work in ways that free up more time, bandwidth, and so forth to prioritize the relationships at the center of our work. Another person said, even though AI is artificial intelligence, it was created by humans, so that what comes up for me is that whoever programmed or created the tools had biases that potentially seeped into those programs. And then there are some comments regarding the distrust or mistrust for AI it is certainly something that needs to be watched and modified over time to ensure that it doesn't do more harm than good. That's the gist of the question, or the responses from the first question.
Awesome. Thank you all so much for sharing. And you're spot on. There is so much that we are learning about AI in terms of bias, in terms of programming, in terms of navigating some of the distrust or mistrust that we might have. I know that one of the first times that I used ChatGPT, I was really skeptical. I was really nervous about what I was going to get back, whether I was putting information incorrectly in order to get responses that weren't biased. And what we know is that there are pros and cons of artificial intelligence as it relates to equity, diversity, inclusion, and justice. And what I want us to do during this next part of our webinar is to really lean into embracing the both and. Oftentimes within diversity, equity, inclusion work, we fall into this trap of either or thinking of things are either really good or really bad, or things are right or wrong. One of the things that we need to learn to do is embrace the nuance, embrace the gray area, and know that the conversations that we're having are complex, and that complexity can exist in spaces like this. And so as we do so, we're going to look a little bit deeper into the pros of AI and some of the cons as well. Some of the advantages that AI offers to us within our organizations is that they're available 24/7. With human intelligence, we often are slated to work certain hours. We're often either on the clock or off the clock, or checking emails, checking things in between, getting our lives together, like preparing dinner, picking up children, so on and so forth. And one of the things that AI offers to us is this availability of access at any given moment in time. Right, so if I have a question that maybe I would ordinarily ask Millie, and I don't have any other resources at the moment, I might go on and seek this information through one of the platforms that Millie shared earlier. One of our go-tos at Nonprofit HR is ChatGPT. The other thing is that AI is often grounded in trends and patterns, which could be a good thing in terms of synthesizing information. So I am a qualitative researcher, and it is really important for me to better understand narratives, better understand patterns, better understand trends that are happening. So this can be a pro, and as we move into cons in just a little bit, you'll also notice that this could also get us into some biased areas as well. It also allows us to have quick output. We type something in and we get an automatic response. And that is allowing us to move faster sometimes in our positions. It allows us to automate processes and be more effective within our positions. And while AI can also have bias, it can also reduce human error, because the amount of information that it's programmed into many of these platforms far outweighs the amount of information that many of us hold or can retrieve in any given moment. It also eliminates physical risk to humans. So as Millie was sharing earlier about when we think about AI, we sometimes think about robots. I'm thinking about the ways that we have modified intelligence and computers to be able to access spaces that might otherwise be harmful to human beings. And it also allows us some increased productivity with lower costs, in terms of the fact that many of these platforms are free and allow us to effectively amplify the work that we're doing in short periods of time. And so I want us to hold on to those pros as we start to look at some of the cons, and really challenging you again to embrace the both and. As someone shared in their reactions to how they feel when we think about the letters AI, it does rely on programmed input. And that programmed input often comes from dominant ideologies. And what I mean by that is that there has been historical levels of access to white cisgender men in technology spaces. And we know that. We also know that if you are to go onto Google and you type in, for example, pictures of hands, the first 5 or 6 pages are predominantly white hands, right? And so the input that we are putting into these systems relies on the information that we currently have and the people who are inputting that information. And so oftentimes it's upholding some dominance. Cons of AI is that they can only perform as well as they are designed. So as we're thinking about the design process or the programming process with AI, we only can achieve what we've once put in. And oftentimes, because we're human and we're biased, there's often shortcomings. AI often lacks empathy and emotion, and this is a huge thing within equity, diversity, inclusion, and justice work. We really want to pay attention to how things are impacting people and the emotions surrounding that. And AI does not have the capacity to have empathy or to demonstrate emotion. It also displaces people in jobs. One of the questions that we asked on the AI survey was around whether or not we think that we will be hiring somebody to help us specifically navigate AI within HR positions. One of the things that I'm thinking about in terms of even going to the grocery store or going to different platforms or calling a call center is that there's been a lot of displacement in jobs because we are relying on technology. These platforms also are not always up to date. So for example, ChatGPT, the last time it was updated is 2021, right? So the input that it has is already inherently old. Knowing that technology and information moves so quickly, we're already 2 years lagging in what output we're getting back. And it's also impossible for us to create neutral technology when humans are inherently biased, because we are the folks that are programming, because we are the folks that are inputting, because we're the ones that are asking the questions, because we're the ones interpreting the data. It is hard to engage in neutral AI because we're not neutral. And so we want to put out the question to you all, hearing some of these things, and again, feel free to go to your question pane. What are some other pros and cons of artificial intelligence that you've thought about? And I'm going to pause there too to see, Atokatha, did we have anything else come in through the chat?
Yes, lots of things have come in through the chat regarding how folks are using AI within their organizations, and I'll read through some of them. We're using AI to draft job descriptions and also job postings. Someone else said to develop verbiage for trainings. Primary use of AI in research, personally and also professionally, curriculum development, surveys, chatbots, grant writing, recruiting, emails and outreach, agenda creation, reviewing resumes. Someone said we love ChatGPT and using it in a variety of ways, including for fundraising, to work on writing performance reviews and also job openings. I'm sure that's with plenty of human input for those kinds of tasks. But those are just some things that have come in so far regarding how folks are using AI currently.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Atokatha. And thank you all so much for sharing that. We know that AI is being used within our organizations. You are here to prove that. Our survey results have shown that you all are using it from everything from job descriptions to meetings to generating research. And so what are the ways that we can better understand bias within artificial intelligence? Because we know that this is only something that's going to increase as we move into the future. And so first and foremost, it is important for us to understand what bias is. And bias refers to any attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, our actions and decisions in an unconscious manner. Essentially what that means is that our brains make associations because we can't possibly process all of the information that we're receiving at any given moment in time. Our brain needs to create shortcuts. And the reason why is to keep us safe. This is a very human instinct to have implicit bias. For example, if Millie and I were out in a forest somewhere and we had a large animal running towards us, it would not do either one of us good to pause, to look at each other, to have a conversation about what we should do in that moment, right? Our brain is gonna hopefully click into action and tell us to run or to get out of that situation, which is so necessary for survival. However, over time, because we have the reliance on our brain, our quick processing, our system 1 brain, we also start to make associations with people. We start to also make associations with whether things are good or bad. And oftentimes we're doing this unknowingly. And the reason why this happens is because we are all born into a world where things are already in place. None of us were born into a world where there was a blank slate. Information has been created, stories have been shared, systems have been at play, and we are born anew into something that's already in existence. And so this brings us to really understanding a little bit about the cycle of socialization. And as I share more about this cycle, I want you all to consider the following question. How might socialization impact bias in AI? So again, keep that question in mind. If you would like to answer that question in the question pane, feel free to do so. But essentially, we are born into a society where things are already set, and we start to engage with our environments. We start to interact with our caregivers or the adults around us. And through that, history and traditions and stories and expectations are passed down. Stereotypes and myths are passed down. Norms and habits are passed down. I want you to think about anything that one of your primary caregivers did when you were younger that you find yourself doing today, right? Where did we pick that up? We picked that up from our environment. And these messages, these expectations, these stories are reinforced by our institutional and cultural systems, such as the media, family and friends, our school textbooks, government and legal systems, and also these cultural standards, right? As somebody who has been engaging in diversity, equity, and inclusion work for over almost 15 years at this point in time, one of the things that I've learned about myself is that I have biases that I still have yet to recognize, right? Growing up in the household that I grew up in, growing up in the body that I grew up in, with the race that I am, the gender that I am, my sexual orientation, it has all given me a different perspective than maybe Millie's perspective, right? I've received similar and different messages than Millie, and some of that is rooted in reality or my reality, and then others is just based on what I've observed about the world around me. And so oftentimes within this cycle is that we start to internalize these messages and we start to have a better understanding of what the world means to us or how we view the world. And then we pass these messages down to the youth of the next generation, whether that is our own children or nieces and nephews or anybody that comes into this world. Those messages are passed down. And that impacts bias because if we're human beings that are engaging with systems and computers to program information, then that starts to get embedded into everything that we do. So the way that bias often shows up in artificial intelligence, particularly with generative AI, is through a variety of different processes. From data input, right? Am I the person that is putting in all of the information for the computer to learn patterns? What information am I pulling? Where am I seeking those sources? How am I utilizing those sources based on my own understanding, based on my own identities, right? So therefore there's bias within the AI programmer. Does the AI programmer have the extensive life experience of every single person on the planet? Are they part of a dominant group? Have they thought about whose needs are being met with this information and who might be missing? That's another way that bias shows up in this process. User asking questions as well. So I heard many of you use this to create job descriptions, or you love ChatGPT, or you're using this to create agendas. The output that we get is only as good as the question that we ask. One of the things that I'm thinking about when I've used ChatGPT in the past is I like to play around and I like to ask questions in different ways to see what answers I get back. For example, I might ask a question of how has X, Y, and Z impacted the social sector, right? I might then ask the question from the perspective of women. How has X, Y, and Z impacted the social sector? From the perspective of Black, Indigenous, people of color, multiracial folks, queer folks, folks who are non-binary, folks who are transgender, what are their experiences? right? So our output's only as good as the question that we're asking. Bias also comes back in that generated response because, again, if we go back to data input in AI programmer, what we're going to get back is what was put in. And then there's bias in our interpretation of the information. Because we process things through our own lens and our own life experience, what we determine or what we gain from the information that we put in often is biased as well. And so those are things to keep in mind as we're thinking about bias in AI. Atokatha, any pros and cons that have come in?
Yes, Rachel. A couple have come in so far. One person says, there are still school districts that lack computers. Therefore, providing limited training for minoritized students to learn how to operate AI. And a second person said, accessibility and equity issues might be a con, whether from differing technology, knowledge, disabilities, etc.
Absolutely. So now we're thinking about accessibility, right? Who has access to AI technology? Who is being trained or educated on AI technology? And what does that look like across identities? What does that look like in terms of youth? What does that look like in terms of people who are aging? And how can we ensure that we are creating equitable environments? And we're going to get there. We're going to talk a little bit about strategies and tools as we move through with our webinar today. But before we do so, we wanted to also frame common types of bias that show up in artificial intelligence. And these might be things that you're familiar with. These might be things that you're just now learning about for the first time. And all of that is okay. So algorithm bias. Thinking about algorithm bias, this is describing the systemic or repeatable errors in computer systems that create unfair outcomes, such as privileging one group over another. One of the things that I think about here is facial recognition programs that are used to detect lighter skin tones, and also automatic faucets. I'm not sure how many of you have ever been in a public restroom that has an automatic faucet that when you put your hands in, the water comes out, right? Even that technology is programmed to better see my skin tone than somebody who has a darker complexion. There's also sample exclusion and selection bias, and this really has to do with data that was used to teach the system. It asks the question is, was our sample representative? Does it include people from a variety of different identities? And what we know is that it often misses the voices and experiences of the most marginalized. There's also prejudice bias, which is data that is used reflects our own socialization. So going back to that cycle of socialization that we just engaged with, we're all receiving messages over time, and our data reflects that. It reflects our false assumptions, it reflects our prejudices, and it could perpetuate stereotypes. And then recall bias. Bias that emerges based on subjective observation and labeling. So throughout the AI process, we are actually creating labels to name some of those patterns that are emerging. And that's also bias because our observations are often subjective. The other thing with recall bias is that IT fields are largely represented by white cisgender men. So the folks that are inputting information are not representative of the people who are consuming or of the general population. And so that is something to keep in mind. And so all of this really leads us to some real life consequences and real life harms associated with AI.
Thanks, Rachel. So we really want to connect intention and impact. And what we mean by that is throughout all our sessions that Rachel and I conduct together, facilitate together, we always talk about, when we're talking about equity, diversity, inclusion, and justice, of the gap or the bridge that exists between our intentions and our impact. So sometimes we have the best of intentions. Most of us as humans have the best of intentions to move this work forward. We have the best of intentions that we're hardwired to connect with each other and create welcoming spaces with each other and productive work environments. But the reality is that that's not always the impact. And sometimes we have consequences. And AI is a perfect example of that. And there are moments where AI can be really beneficial, but we also have to recognize that there are moments where there's actual consequences and impacts that we might not intend as we use artificial intelligence technology. So these are some headlines that actually have existed throughout the last 2 years across different articles, anywhere from the Harvard Business Review to Time Magazine to experts in the artificial intelligence space. And we just wanted to elevate some of these headlines so we can see what is the conversation that's currently occurring around some of the impact of artificial intelligence that we're trying to mitigate as we center equity, diversity, inclusion, and justice. So things like perpetuating systemic racism in our algorithms, human judgment, and the fact that if the data is coming from humans and we all have bias, as Rachel shared earlier, that's part of the human experience, that means that artificial intelligence and our outputs from artificial intelligence also are biased. And what does that mean for decision making when we're looking at fairness and equity? We also want to look at things through the lens of what are the opportunities and what are the risks, right? And when we're talking about bias, there actually is a term that's called AI bias. And specifically, this term refers to what Rachel was sharing with us earlier around implicit bias, but really relating to what happens when an algorithm produces a result that is systematically prejudiced and it behaves in a way that it's not supposed to. So while we have the best intentions, there's error, there's assumptions that the machine learning processes can make. And while the data might seem unbiased at the surface, sometimes further exploration will show us otherwise. And some examples of these, Rachel, you alluded to this earlier through Google search, but for example, currently women make up 27%, if not more, of CEOs in the US across organizations. But when we do a Google search, only 11% of the images when you type in CEO that are populated that show women, it's only 11%. So there's a gap there, right? So the intention is to bring up images that are representative of that population, but the impact does not align with that. We also saw this over the last few years with Amazon in an open conversation. This was covered by the media as well, where they had to stop using some of the artificial intelligence tool when they discovered that the tool for the recruitment processes was biased towards hiring more men. And often this happens because perhaps the data that was inputted into the tool had a higher percentage of men working at Amazon. So then the algorithm assumes, and the system assumes, that a male would be the ideal candidate. But there is a gap between the current system that we have with our biases and the systems and culture we're trying to create. And we have to be mindful that AI does not always address that gap. So it's our job as humans to be mindful of the gap and figure out how to mitigate it. And these are just 2 quotes that emerged from this space from some of our research as we were preparing for you all. And these really resonated with us because they really emphasize the idea that our choice is in our hands. So it's up to us to really determine and recognize that we all have inherent biases. There's no way around this. And if we can recognize that we have biases, then we are able to set boundaries and explore further how to best use AIs. And a perfect example of this was, we had another quote actually up here, but we wanted to just give you all a few. But we also talked about algorithms with apartment renters, for example, and mortgages, where applicants from disproportionately disadvantaged communities and populations, due to historical patterns of segregations, were seen as poisoning the data with the algorithms were built, right? So who is the algorithm benefiting is often those systems and processes that are benefiting in our current society. So we want to keep in mind that we don't want the algorithm to replicate inequities. We want it to help us mitigate inequities in our space. So we want to show you all a quick video that captures this. We shared, Rachel and I are both educators and have operated in the education space. So we recognize that some of you might resonate with us having this conversation, but others might want to see the information presented in a different format. And we thought this video was really informative and helpful in understanding how prejudice and biases may show up in the AI space. So we're going to play this for you all and would love for you to share your thoughts throughout the chat in the question pane as you're watching the video. So what thoughts are coming up for you or reflections as we watch this video today?
We as humans are biased. We have a lot of prejudices, some that we know about and some that we don't. And there's this idea that if you turn over decision making to computers instead of humans, that we can avoid some of these biases. But we're learning that algorithms can be just as biased as the humans that create them. Algorithms are becoming more and more involved in major decisions in many industries. They're already helping decide who gets a loan, who's hired or fired, who can travel freely, and even who's arrested and how long they go to jail. If these algorithms are flawed or biased, it could actually amplify injustice and inequality. AI is only as sharp as the data it learns from. For instance, a study at MIT Media Lab found that the leading facial recognition systems correctly identified white male faces 99% of the time. But with dark-skinned female faces, it made mistakes up to 35% of the time. That's likely because the data used to train the software is often overwhelmingly white and male. One widely used data set was estimated to be more than 75% male and 80% white. ProPublica recently investigated the algorithms used in courtrooms used to predict the risk of criminals committing future crimes. These risk assessments can be used to help make critical decisions like who can be released from prison and how much the bail amount should be. They found that the algorithms falsely predicted Black defendants to be future criminals at almost twice the rate of white defendants. But researchers are shining a light on these systems, the people that create them, and the data they train on. They're part of a movement calling for algorithmic accountability.
As algorithms get more complicated, as we start using machine learning and artificial intelligence, even as they become more powerful, they're becoming less transparent, which means it's hard for us to be able to really tell why an algorithm is behaving the way it is, why it made a decision the way it did. The transparency is becoming more difficult, but it's very important in order to make sure that these algorithms aren't behaving in a biased way. This is a reminder that diversity is incredibly important among the groups of people that are actually creating the algorithms, because without diversity, biases can be baked into these algorithms, and so they'll behave in a prejudiced way, just like a biased person would.
So just some perspective, bringing together what we've been discussing around artificial intelligence. And we're going to talk briefly momentarily about some tools and strategies as promised that you all can utilize. But keeping in mind and thinking through as you watch that video, we would love to see the question pane, your responses to what thoughts and feelings came up when you saw that video, when you think about your current practices in your organization or your role with artificial intelligence. Who in your organization is defining how we're using artificial intelligence, and who is responsible for making those decisions? Is that group diverse? What are the cultural norms operating within that? What are some of the consequences we might not be thinking about as we use artificial intelligence across our organizations to achieve our mission, especially with the communities that we are working with and working in partnership with? We also want to think about the differences between how we use AI. So a lot of it is not only the tool, but the how we're utilizing it. So thinking of pieces of how do we move from automation and thinking of artificial intelligence as a lens of, oh, this is just going to make this easier and I could just automate it and input this into this feature or this program, versus having an augmented view, right? So seeing artificial intelligence as helping us to work that we're trying to accomplish and helping us create complex tasks and accomplish complex tasks versus just automating those systems. Considering our data inputs, which Rachel and I were talking about earlier. So are we reviewing that data on the front end so that we produce high quality data inputs through the algorithm, right? So are we learning from organizational and industry psychology around what is the environment that we're trying to create? What are decision-making processes and protocols that we can use to predict success as we're using artificial intelligence? And also human intervention. Some of us in the artificial intelligence space who have been doing research around this have heard of the concept of the black box, right? So that gap or that piece between what happens when data is inputted versus what we see as an output. And what does that look like? And sometimes we know how decisions are made through artificial intelligence, and sometimes we have no insight into that. So Amazon learned this, as I shared earlier, around their hiring practices when they saw that the algorithm was having a biased perspective, and they had to go back to the drawing board and explore, where is this coming from? Why is this happening? How do we mitigate this? So being open to the fact that these systems can make mistakes and that it's trying to replicate our human biases, but that doesn't mean that we can't take steps to mitigate this as well in our role. So we want to invite you to consider this question again. What are the pros and cons of using artificial intelligence within your organization? So you might have started with specific thought process before we engaged in this session, but as we've shared more content, as we shared more experiences, what are some other pros and cons that are emerging? And we would love for you all to place that in the questions pane so that we can take a look and see what's coming up for you all.
And as you all are engaging with that question prompt, we wanted to dive into some tools and strategies. As you can remember earlier, we said embracing the both and. Right? We know that we're using artificial intelligence and generative AI within our organizations today. We also know that bias is real and bias is embedded in the process. So what are ways that we can mitigate bias within our organizations? First and foremost, it's important for us to recognize that more than half of nonprofit organizations are thinking about hiring AI-specific roles within HR in the next 1 to 3 years, because we know how crucial AI has become in our daily life and all of the opportunities that we have to become more effective at meeting our missions by utilizing AI. So what are ways that we can mitigate bias within our organization as we lean deeper into AI? First and foremost, training staff on implicit bias, what it is, where it comes from, why we all have it, helping people to illuminate the biases that exist for them, and then also training specifically on bias in AI. Training people on what to look for to mitigate bias. What are some of the patterns that they're noticing, how to ask questions of, for example, ChatGPT and other platforms. And then including diverse human touch points in AI processes, not only to review information for accuracy and consistency, but to also determine potential bias and patterns. So who is in the room that is engaging in these conversations and reviewing the applicants that maybe came out of using AI for job recruitment? Can we start to assess patterns? Are we looking across gender? Are we looking across race? Is there opportunity for AI platforms to also recognize non-binary and trans individuals? Are there opportunities for us to engage with people who speak multiple languages? And so being able to assess those patterns and pick up potential bias in the process will help us to learn what to input later on when we're engaging in the same process, or how to course correct once we get that information back. Thinking about hiring an AI professional on your team to assist in ethical considerations. So having somebody that's equipped in what AI is, how it works, and what processes we can potentially create for our teams. The other thing with hiring an AI professional is that there's also an opportunity for people to create internal automated responses. So we could actually program our own data to give us responses on patterns within our own organization. And so an AI person might be able to assist with that. And then determining your organization's stance on adopting AI for practice. Have you all had that hard conversation about, is this something that we want to utilize as part of our practice area? Knowing that individuals have been using it, but is this something that we want to organizationally commit to? And if so, which ones? And so that brings us to this next set of tools and strategies to mitigate bias in our organizations, including building out processes for AI use within our organizations with attention to mitigating bias. So what does that process look like? If I am to use assistive technology, or if I am to use AI within a certain process, what is the protocol that I need to follow? How many human touch points do I need to have? Who needs to review that information? What are the types of questions that I should be asking or shouldn't be asking? All of that should be built out within your policy. And then creating a toolbook of what's currently being used within your organization and deciding which platforms your organization approves of and for which tasks. So it might be asking people to have those brave and honest conversations of, we know that y'all have been using this and we support that and we want to make really great decisions as an organization to mitigate bias so that we can ultimately have the most positive impact on the communities that we're serving. So let's pull together what those platforms are and let's do a deep dive into researching the gaps so that we can make some really effective decisions based on our organization and our specific needs. Again, determining if you will be engaging with internal versus open systems for the point of validity. As I shared earlier, organizations have been programming their own systems. They have been creating AI and programming AI for decades at this point in time. Are you wanting to utilize open systems such as ChatGPT, or are you trying to create and utilize your own data to create new data? Continue to foster a trust-based culture in terms of systems, ethics, and honesty, so that we're able to have these critical conversations about what AI looks like. Ensuring access to AI education expands across age, role, and identities. One of the conversations that I've heard a lot is around the concept of age and how younger folks or the Gen Z is really using AI within their jobs, right? Or as people who are aging or people who have more tenure within our organizations, they don't understand technology. They don't understand AI. And so we want to actually dismantle that myth, right? That contributes to this system of ageism. We want us to make sure that we are providing access, providing education to everybody across age, but also across role as well. Are we only allowing AI education for people who are programmers or people who are researchers? Or are we providing this to people who are community centered or service learning positions or frontline positions, community-based positions, and making sure that there is equity and access? As we shared earlier as well, the output is only as good as our input. And we need to make sure that we are using inclusive language within our organizations and that we've created almost our own dictionary of what those terms are and the terms that we will and won't use. For example, there are terms that could be used that kind of embody more of a deficit understanding or deficit mindset of communities. For example, vulnerable populations or underrepresented populations, as opposed to marginalized, historically minoritized, specifically naming queer people or specifically naming people who identify as having a disability. And so coming to an agreement on what that language looks like and then revisiting that, because language changes over time. Another way to mitigate bias in this system is to create bias assessment teams within your organization. This is a really great opportunity for you all to create a committee that assesses bias in all of the outputs that you have and all of the inputs that you have related to AI. This can also be applied to organizations who are not necessarily using AI to generate information. This could be used just to engage in conversations about how you're meeting the needs of the people that you're serving. Are there gaps? Are you noticing that even though you've put in a program to stop childhood hunger, that childhood hunger is only being stopped in predominant places based on geography or based on race or based on different dimensions of diversity? And then assessing patterns. How are you applying AI standards and consequences across identities? What we mean by this is, are you thinking about how people are able to use AI within their role, and based on what their role is, based on what their identity is, whether or not there's double standards? One of the things that I think about is in terms of the narratives that we create around AI, around the ways or the reasons why we utilize it. So thinking about how for somebody who uses AI in their work very regularly, we can either label them innovative or we can label them as lazy, right? And what are the patterns that we're noticing in alignment with how those stereotypes play out based on systems of oppression that have been in existence since the onset, right? And making sure that we are assessing those patterns and that we are dismantling white supremacy culture and stereotypes as we apply these standards. And so there's also some questions that we can consider to mitigate bias. And this is throughout every step of the process. In fact, we actually encourage every single person to bring these 4 questions into any decision that they're making within their organization, whether it's related to artificial intelligence or not. The first is whose needs are being met. And the second is whose needs are not being met. Who might benefit from this information, this decision, this data, and who might be harmed? And when we keep those 4 questions in mind, essentially what we're doing is we're creating a foundation of EDIJ in everything that we do. And so we want you to keep these questions in your front pocket so that they're easily accessible. They're something that you go to often so that you can engage in making sure that as you're serving your mission and as you're serving all of the people that you're serving, that you're not actually doing differential harm to people, whether that's through the use of AI or not. And so there's also some additional considerations to removing AI bias. And this is actually something that was created by the Artificial Intelligence Board for people who actually program data and create some of those patterns and generate some of that information that gets input into these systems. But one of the ways that you can use this within your nonprofit organization is also being aware of these things, such as contextual awareness. What is going on at the time? What is the context of the way that you're asking the question? Are you specifically looking at the context of your geographical area? Are you looking at the context of race? Are you looking at the context of gender, the context of religion? Test and mitigate practice and processes. Again, engage in those conversations and ensure that you have multiple voices, multiple roles, multiple levels, multiple identities in the space so that you can start to question the data that you get back. And that goes back to these fact-based conversations, right? What is truly a fact, what's objective and what's subjective, and really trying to parse those pieces out. Making sure that you're engaging in bias research. Continue to do your own personal work of illuminating your own biases and how that might impact how you're inputting data to get information back. And then diversifying AI. And while not all of us are responsible for creating the data or creating or generating the information that gets put into these systems, we are responsible for what comes out. We are responsible for the ways that we ask questions, and we're responsible for the ways that we are sharing the knowledge out. And so making sure that there's a variety of different perspectives in this space and that we're consistently checking ourselves for possible gaps and misses. And so what's some support that you will ultimately have to invest in? We actually want to open this up in our question pane. Feel free, if you would like to engage with this question, what support will you ultimately have to invest in as we move deeper into AI? One of the things that we know on our end is that you don't have to do it alone. Sometimes these conversations can be scary. Sometimes these platforms can be overwhelming. Sometimes we might not know where to start. I know the first time that I used ChatGPT, I was like in way over my head. I was like, what do I do? What is this? What do I ask? How do I talk to my team about why I'm using it and what I'm using it for? And how do I assess any gaps in what's coming back? So we encourage you to engage with the EDIJ professional to help you work through leading the conversation and building trust within your organizations. Honest conversations about the ways that we're using it, the ways that we want to use it is going to be crucial. Setting the culture with equitable education policies and processes. So EDIJ professionals can help you to ensure that you are creating policies and processes that ultimately serve people at the margins, as well as those that have historically been dominant. EDIJ professionals can help you assess patterns. I know that a lot of what we talked about today was figure out those patterns, assess those patterns, but we might not know how to do that. How do we collect data within our own organization? For example, how do we start to keep track of applicants that we're getting in from places where we used AI and places that we've done it with just the human process, right? Do we see differences in the outcomes? Are we seeing bias in both of these processes? How can we account for that? Creating bias assessment teams. We're equipped to help you create teams or committees to think about how we can start to look for those patterns internally and get people trained up and skilled up in being able to do so. And then determining community impact and ensuring mission alignment. Because at the end of the day, nonprofit organizations, we do what we do because we care about the people that we're serving. And we need to make sure that we're leveraging technology in ways that are serving our communities and ways that are not doing unintentional harm to the people that are most directly impacted by the things that we're trying to solve for. And so we know that we've given you a lot of information. We know that this can be really overwhelming. And so we want to make sure that you all are engaging with each other, with your networks, with your organizations, to have and further this conversation around bias, particularly as it relates to artificial intelligence. And so we want to pause there, and we're going to pass it to Atokatha to start us off with our questions.
Thank you so much, Millie and Rachel, for such a great presentation. The chat has been on fire. People are really excited about this content and have been sharing their insights and answering questions as well. Regarding your question on the impacts, one person said, our culture is relatively homogenous. There is a risk of using AI internally in recruiting in a way that compounds that despite intentions to do otherwise. Another person said, one con feels like we know AI is systematically flawed and biased, and we are expecting institutions and individuals to solve for this. I'm wondering if you both want to respond to either of those comments as we look to receive more questions in the questions pane as we move into our Q&A session.
Absolutely. And I think the comment about things being homogenous is something we definitely see and we encounter a lot in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space. And I think that's where we elevate the importance of the tool of the human piece, right? So AI is responding to the data that's being inputted. So if we have a homogenous culture, how do we have a conversation on the front end before implementing these artificial intelligence tools to really discuss what is the current culture? Where are we seeing the similarities? And what are we hoping to bring to diversify the culture and change the cultural context of our organization and how we work together? And then being mindful that artificial intelligence might be useful, but also how are we being mindful of what artificial intelligence might be missing and how are we catching that on the front end? So how are we preparing for, okay, we're going to use this tool to help us go through these resumes, but also how are we going to make sure that we have a protocol or system and process? And much of the diversity, equity, and inclusion work is around our systems and processes, not just our mindset. So what systems and processes are we setting up in the recruitment process for this role, for this new opportunity, so that we're having discussions along the way and so that we have people checking for bias, right? As Rachel was talking about earlier, and identifying, okay, well, we're seeing this pattern based on this platform that we're using or based on this tool, we need to go back in and maybe set up a different structure, or we need to go back and maybe use a different tool or have a different conversation. So being open to course correcting along the way is something that's really important. When often with artificial intelligence, we're like, well, this is a computer, it's computerized, it's a tool, so therefore the output is close to perfect. How do we flip that on its head, so to speak, and say the output is there to support me, but as a human, I can center empathy and I can center consciousness and awareness around the context. The algorithm just wants to solve for the problem you're posing, but it can't solve for the nuances of your organization. So that is where the human capital comes in and where those discussions can be really powerful. But Rachel, I want to pass it to you to see if you want to add anything as well.
I completely agree, and really leaning into those 4 questions that we posed earlier, I think is a really great way to start. If you don't know how to assess for patterns, if you don't know what to do about homogeneous culture or homogeneous information, start to think about who's in the room. Start to think about what voices are being heard and what voices aren't being heard. And the other thing to think about is, okay, so if you're using AI in one capacity, maybe ensure that your rubric is being created by humans and making sure that there's so many different human touch points throughout that process. So as Millie said, you're not just relying on the information that you get back. It has to be something that we are in partnership with consistently. And it has to be something that's used not to take shortcuts, but for us to become more effective and to reduce the bias that we have in our processes. And on the front end, that's going to take a little bit more time, and it's worth it because of the ways that nonprofits operate to build up communities. We owe that to them and we owe that to ourselves. And so being able to pause and slow down for just a moment to get clarity on what this looks like for us.
Great, and as we're moving into our official Q&A portion of today's program, I want to remind our participants to go ahead and pop your questions into the questions pane, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. Here's the first question for you both. Are there specific industries or sectors or subsectors where the integration of AI and EDIJ is more pressing or relevant? And will a future workshop address these distinctions?
Absolutely. So I would say that it's extremely relevant in all of the different sectors. I will say that we are just starting to get better research and better clarity on the ways that different sectors are using this. I know that within HR, this is a conversation that we've been having for quite some time around how we engage in mitigating bias in our employee life cycle. I know that this has been used specifically within the education sector. I know that this has been used within the business sector. So I don't know that there's different sectors that are using this more than others. I think we're just gaining clarity on how people are using it because it hasn't been an open conversation to date. It was really interesting. We actually had an internal conversation about AI and the use of AI at nonprofit HR. And I had no idea half of the ways that my colleagues were using AI and things that I hadn't even thought about. And so even just that conversation illuminated so many different things that I hadn't thought about. And so it's out there. And I think those honest conversations are going to lead us to a place where we have a better understanding of how we can leverage it for whatever sector that we're part of, whatever area that we are a part of, in ways that are applicable to us. Millie, I don't know if there was anything that you would add.
I'm aligned in what you shared. I think just want to continue to elevate what you shared, Rachel, around having the conversations, but also having the conversations around the hesitations and fears around using artificial intelligence as a team and exploring how are we each entering the space. So we started the session asking you all what thoughts and feelings came up around artificial intelligence. We encourage you all to ask that for your team as well and the people you work with, and share what's coming up for us. What do we feel comfortable using? What don't we feel comfortable using? And what tools do we actually need? Recognizing that we're all entering this space with different levels of experience. Rachel, you all had alluded earlier to some of the biases we have around age, right? When it comes to using technology and all these other pieces. So part of mitigating that is having an open conversation. Well, if we're going to use this tool, what do we need to do in regards to learning and development, so that we can ensure that there's levels of accessibility as well. But I would echo what you shared, that I think it's going to be something that impacts us across all industries and sectors. And it's just a matter of us learning, how are we entering this? What do we need? And being able to recognize when we need to take a step back and adjust and course correct as needed.
Great, here's another question. As thought leaders in the EDIJ space, how can we influence our bigger and sometimes more powerful partners to adjust their AI norms as well?
Absolutely. And I think that this goes back to just having those conversations and building relationships. We know that power dynamics are at play within every organization, and we want you to approach this in the same way that you would as it relates to inclusive culture. Maybe even suggesting having an open conversation as an organization at a staff meeting about, as Millie shared earlier, the hopes and fears, but also the ways that people have seen bias showing up in their processes. And so hopefully that can motivate leadership to better understand the ways that AI might be impacting in disproportionate ways that they weren't necessarily aware of. The other thing is being able to provide any sort of research or data that supports how this either acts in accordance with your mission or against your mission, and coming up with some solutions as well. Anytime you're engaging in a conversation about things that we want to do differently or that we want to change, we should also come in with some ideas of what that process could look like, even if we don't have the answers. And we don't suggest going in with answers. We suggest going in with those questions to probe deeper conversations as it relates to engaging leadership in these conversations. Millie, anything you'd add there?
I think the only thing I would add is exploring how you can best be heard. And what we mean by that is when Rachel and I engage in facilitating sessions in the EDIJ space with different organizations across different levels and roles, we often think about, okay, this is the content we want to cover, but how do we frame it in a way where it can be heard? And I think there's a difference between sharing information, and there's value in that, but also how do we frame it in a way where the person and the audience we're trying to have the conversation with can hear our perspective and really be open to coming together at the table and having that discussion. I think the other thing is exploring the fear. So the fear around things that we're sharing or not sharing, where does that come from? How much of that fear is accurate, which sometimes it is, and we have to dig deeper into how to solve for that, and how much of that might be perceptive based on our experiences. And the last thing I'll offer is, I think something that we have seen through our DEI assessments as well is the value add sometimes as needed of having an external partner. And I think often sometimes when you have someone who has that outside view and broader lens of what's going on in an organization, what's going on across roles and dynamics, and even able to identify some of the biases that sometimes we can't see, as Rachel said, like sometimes we have conversations where I might be able to identify a bias Rachel has, and Rachel might be able to identify a bias I have, right? Because we can see things through a different lens from the outside looking in. So sometimes considering where can we collaborate outside of our space of the people we work with day to day to see if we can get a different perspective or lens. And that's something that we often do in our work as well with our assessments.
Great, and someone is asking for insight on how you would engage employees across their organization that is relatively siloed to have conversations regarding AI technologies that they are using, especially in this instance where it appears that there is a fear of AI taking certain jobs already.
I think a good question to ask is, what's causing the silo? So taking a step back, and we often do that in this work, is saying, okay, we're seeing this pattern, what's causing it before we try to bring in this other conversation. So we want to collect data around how artificial intelligence is being used, but if there are silos occurring in an organization, it might be worth taking a step back before collecting that data and exploring where are the silos coming from, what's creating that pattern and trend, how do we help mitigate that first, so then when we do ask for that data and we can have those conversations, we're more willing to get a response and more willing to have people open to the conversation. But Rachel, what would you add to that?
I completely co-sign that, and also would add that there are also ways for us to collect information that in ways that are more anonymous. So platforms that we've used within nonprofit HRs like Mentimeter.com, where you can actually put out a question to the group and the responses come in anonymously, and that could be shared out. And so one of the things that that could do is build trust or normalize how people are feeling, or some of the hopes and fears that people have, because they start to see themselves in other people's responses. The other thing that can potentially assist in dismantling some of those silos too is transparency from leadership, and transparency amongst department leaders engaging in this conversation in almost like a fishbowl capacity, where sometimes staff needs to see all of the directors having this conversation first before there's a sense of psychological safety in sharing their own thoughts and opinions. And so some of those power dynamics should be assessed, as Millie shared, of trying to figure out the root, but it also takes time to create trust within an organization if it's not currently there. And so being able to engage in some of those platforms that can assist with carrying the conversation on in the meantime.
Right, and another question has to do with bias assessment teams. You mentioned that earlier. Can you elaborate on that?
Absolutely. And so many organizations have started to create DEI committees or EDIJ committees, where the focus of that group of people is to amplify the mission of equity, diversity, inclusion, and justice within the organization, whether that be to facilitate a training schedule or education schedule, or to create an inclusive meeting schedule. You know, especially for our global organizations, we always have the problem of, well, it's always based on United States time, or it's always based on East Coast time. And what about people who are in, for example, California, if you're within the United States, or what about the time difference in Bicol, right? Or any other place in the Philippines or Asia, Africa, and those time differences. So we utilize people and their collective knowledge to look at these different policies and processes, and to create strategy and to share power. as it relates to amplifying diversity, equity, and inclusion, bias assessment teams are somewhat similar. In terms of the purpose of this committee would be to specifically start to collect some of that information on how AI is being used. Maybe this is the group that starts to look into different ways that bias is amplified within certain platforms, and then taking some of the conversation to, okay, well, now that we got this input back, what are some of the things that we think are missing based on our own experiences? How might I be seen in this data or not? And so it's a collective of voices in a space that are able to analyze bias as a group so that there is more of an opportunity for our conversation to be inclusive. So for example, even though Millie and I both do EDIJ work, we have different experiences, we have different identities, we have different skill sets in many ways, shapes and forms, and there's also a lot of overlap between the things that we do. But when we're both in a space and can bounce ideas off of each other, whatever we get out of that conversation is generally greater than what we could generate alone. And that's essentially what we're trying to do, is we're trying to create groups of people that can come together and diversify the voices of the input that we're getting. Millie, anything you would add there?
No, I think that captures that perfectly. I'm aligned on that, so.
Great questions.
Looks like we're coming to the end of our Q&A session. I think someone has put in a comment and then a question seeking clarification, and it reads, it sounds like there is a need for more work to be done to advance and bring decision makers up to speed about bias, EDIJ, and experiences of marginalized groups in the first place, so that they can understand the impact of AI and its use. Is that correct?
Yes, I would say absolutely. And I think that work is ongoing. I think we sometimes get the question of, will there ever be a space where we're not doing diversity, equity, and inclusion work? And while that would be ideal, Rachel and I always have this conversation, the rest of our team, this work is ongoing because our identities are constantly evolving. The world we exist in and we operate in and the environments that we're working in and our cultures, those are evolving as well. So if that's the case, that means that our learning has to be ongoing as well throughout this journey. So I would say yes, that is the case. And two, how do we practice grace? And what I mean by that is recognizing that we are entering all this work from different experiences, which I mentioned earlier, but I think that's so important because sometimes as we're trying to move this work forward, as we're learning new pieces when it comes to artificial intelligence or our own biases, there are emotions that come up with that. So I encourage and push us to lean into that discomfort of being comfortable and exploring what's coming up for us, but also holding space when that might not be aligned or might look different for what's coming up for someone else in these conversations. And as we continue to do this learning and development around implicit biases in conjunction with artificial intelligence.
I would also add and say that training and education is so important across all levels, but particularly amongst management and leadership positions, because there's so much concentration of power. And so engaging with external consultants or external organizations to build up the education and competency of leadership, I think is extremely important as a step towards engaging in this conversation about AI. But the other way that this can be incorporated into the foundation of what we do as an organization is start to think about when you have vacancies for leadership positions or any other positions, what DEI or EDIJ competencies or criteria are we putting into our job descriptions to ensure that the people that we are bringing into our organizations are equipped to have these conversations and at high levels. The other thing that is important for us to think about too is who's missing from the table, who have we historically had in levels and positions of leadership within our organization, and why? And how do we solve for that? What biases might exist in our current recruitment system as it relates to even getting people across different identities into leadership positions? And so those are all things to consider. But yes, it is a prelude to being able to engage in conversations about bias and AI. And that's some work that we should be doing across all levels in all areas of our life.
Thank you so much, Dr. Forrester and Millie, for such a wonderful conversation and leading such a dynamic discussion. That's all the time we have for today's Q&A. Thank you so much to everyone who attended. We hope you found it to be valuable. And there are more webinars coming up in 2023. Be sure to check out our events calendar at nonprofithr.com/events. Also, please be sure to complete the feedback survey that will pop up once the webcast is ended. Your comments help us with our planning and do inform the topics we cover as well. If you'd like information about services Nonprofit HR is able to help your nonprofit move through, there you may email us at solutions@nonprofithr.com or visit us online at nonprofithr.com. And now, Dr. Forrester and Millie, I'd like to turn it back over to you for any final words that you would like to leave with our participants.
I think some of the words that I would like to leave with you all is that wherever you are in your journey is okay. And that this is a conversation, EDIJ is a conversation, EDIJ is an act and a journey that should be ongoing, as Millie shared earlier. And so if the information here was new, that's great. If it was something that you've already started to think about, you're in the right place, you're in the right space. And we want you to just dive deeper into thinking, how can I create an atmosphere for the people within my organization to have psychological safety and to be able to bring their full authentic selves to work? And how can I also create that same narrative and that same experience for the people that we're serving? And if you're having trouble getting to an answer for that, partner with other people, partner with organizations, reach out to us at Nonprofit HR, because we're here to help you, because you deserve all of that and more.
I echo all of that. And the last thing I'll leave you all with is that there's growth and discomfort. This journey is not comfortable. When we're learning something new, it doesn't always feel, we don't experience it as comfortable, but there is growth in the discomfort. So embrace the discomfort, lean into it. And as Rachel said, don't be afraid to lean into support as well for anything that you might need, whether it's with us at Nonprofit HR, whether it's within each other, but utilize your resources and be open to the experience as we navigate this new world we're living in.
Again, thanks so much to our presenters, and thank you to our attendees as well. We hope you enjoyed the experience, and we'll see you on our next webinar. Take care.